My name is Gemma Lucasta. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the woman people describe as steady, dependable, rational, the one who keeps things running without needing applause. I live in Seattle now. I work in organizational consulting, which is a polite way of saying I see patterns other people pretend not to notice. In meetings, I'm often underestimated. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I don't need to dominate a room to understand it. Most people assume quiet means passive. It doesn't. It means observant. If you met me during the years this story takes place, you probably would have thought I had a stable, comfortable relationship. We traveled occasionally. We had dinner parties. We shared inside jokes, or at least, I believed we did. But one night, I discovered something that felt small and devastating at the same time. I discovered we hadn't laughed together in over a year. Not polite laughter, not social laughter, genuine, involuntary, can't breathe laughter. I didn't realize it at first. It wasn't a dramatic fight or betrayal that opened my eyes. It was something quieter. I was scrolling through old videos on my phone, the kind you forget you even filmed, and I found one from 2 summers ago. We were in a tiny rental kitchen, arguing about how to pronounce gnocchi, and I was laughing in a way I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. And I realized that laugh belonged to another version of our relationship. That was the beginning. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic exit scene in the rain. This is a story about what happens when you slowly recognize that the role you're playing in someone else's life is not the role you agreed to, and how power can return to you the moment you decide to see clearly. I'm going to tell you exactly what I noticed, exactly what I ignored, and exactly how silence, the same silence people mistook for weakness, became the most decisive thing I ever chose. If you've ever looked at someone you love and wondered when the warmth quietly disappeared, have you ever realized the shift long after it already happened to him? I was the stable one. That's how he introduced me to people, sometimes jokingly, sometimes not. This is Gemma. She's the responsible one. Everyone would laugh. I would smile. In our circle, I was the planner, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who booked flights early enough to get better seats, the one who made sure the fridge wasn't empty before a long work week. If something needed to be handled quietly and efficiently, it landed in my hands. And I accepted that role without resistance. Because being competent feels safe. It's a kind of currency. If you're useful enough, people value you, or at least, they don't question your place. What I didn't realize at the time was how easily usefulness can replace intimacy. In public, he was charismatic, quick with jokes, warm in that effortless way some men are when they're performing charm instead of living it. At dinner parties, he would tell stories about our trips, the hiking mishap in Oregon, the time I accidentally ordered the spiciest dish on the menu and pretended I wasn't dying. The stories always ended with a punchline about me, never cruel, just gently diminishing. She's intense about planning. She triple checks everything. She'd probably build a spreadsheet for our grocery list. Everyone laughed. I did too. Because technically, none of it was false. But over time, I noticed something subtle. The laughter was always directed at me, never shared with me. I was the straight line that made his humor look sharper. And privately, I told myself it didn't matter, that relationships are about balance. If he were the light one, I could be the grounded one. If he needed the stage, I didn't. That was the narrative I built. Inside the relationship, I was the emotional regulator. If tension appeared, I dissolved it. If he withdrew, I gave him space. If he was stressed from work, I absorbed the mood without asking for equal support in return. Not because he demanded it, because I preemptively offered it. It took me years to understand that being low maintenance is often just high self-abandonment in disguise. But back then, I saw it as maturity. When friends described us, they'd say, "You two are solid," and we were. No dramatic fights, no explosive scenes. We functioned well, efficiently, like a well-run household. I mistook smoothness for closeness. There was affection. Of course. We shared a bed, shared bills, shared routines. We moved through life like synchronized swimmers aligned in motion, but rarely looking at each other underwater. If someone had asked me then, "Are you happy?" I would have said yes without hesitation. Because I measured happiness by stability. I didn't ask myself a different question: do I feel seen? I don't think he intentionally overlooked me. That's the uncomfortable truth. There was no villain, no cruelty, just a gradual recalibration of attention. His career grew, his world expanded, and I became infrastructure. Essential, unnoticed. I remember one evening vividly. We were hosting friends, and I'd spent hours preparing. Food arranged perfectly, candles lit, music is soft in the background. When guests arrived, he kissed my cheek and said, "I don't know what I'd do without her. She keeps everything running." It was meant as praise. And yet, I felt like a system, not a woman, not a partner, a structure. I smiled. I poured wine. I moved through the room like the quiet engine beneath the surface. That's who I was to them. Reliable, controlled, steady. What I didn't realize was that invisibility doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in through appreciation that slowly replaces intimacy. And when you are good at holding everything together, no one thinks to ask whether you're quietly coming apart. The first small cut didn't look like disrespect. That's why I almost missed it. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just the quiet rhythm of routine. I had made reservations at a small Italian place downtown, one of those softly lit restaurants where conversation feels intentional. We hadn't had a real dinner out in weeks. When I reminded him that morning, he said, "Oh, right. Tonight, not enthusiasm, not reluctance, just acknowledgement." At the restaurant, he kept his phone face up on the table. That was new. It buzzed twice during appetizers, 3 times during the main course. Each time, he glanced down. Each time, he said, "Sorry, just work." I nodded. Of course, it was work. I asked about his week. He answered in efficient summaries. When I mentioned something that had happened in my consulting project, a difficult mediation I'd successfully navigated, he smiled politely and said, "You're good at that stuff." That stuff! I don't know why that phrase stayed with me. Maybe because I had just spent 40 hours resolving a conflict between 2 senior executives who refused to speak to each other. Maybe because my work required emotional precision. Or maybe because reducing it to that stuff felt like erasing the complexity of something I cared about. But I let it go. The small cut wasn't what he said, it was what didn't follow. No follow-up question, no curiosity, no, "How did you handle it?" Just a shift back to his phone lighting up. Halfway through dessert, he laughed loudly at something on his screen. What I asked, smiling automatically, "Just a meme from the group chat," he said, still looking down. He didn't show me. I don't think he meant to exclude me. It didn't feel malicious. It felt unconscious. But I noticed something then. The warmth in his laughter was immediate, unfiltered, easy. I couldn't remember the last time that sound had been directed toward me. On the drive home, he talked about a new opportunity at work, a possible promotion, a relocation option in a few years. He spoke as if the future were a landscape he was mapping alone. I contributed practical thoughts, logistics, financial implications. He said, "See, this is why I need you. You think of the details." Need? Again, it sounded like praise, but I felt like an advisor, not a partner. Later that night, as he slept, I lay awake and replayed the evening in my mind. Nothing was technically wrong, no argument, no insult. If I described it to a friend, they would have said, "He's just busy. It's normal." And that's what I told myself. It's normal for phones to interrupt dinner. It's normal for work to dominate conversation. It's normal for relationships to settle. But something had shifted in me. Because for the first time, I felt peripheral in a moment that was supposed to be shared. The next morning, I almost forgot about it. That's how small cuts work. They don't demand attention. They ask for dismissal. But somewhere beneath my rational explanations, a quiet awareness began to form. The laughter at the screen, the absence of curiosity, the word need instead of want. It wasn't enough to confront, it wasn't enough to accuse, but it was enough to remember. And I did. After that dinner, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. There were no explosive fights to point to, no obvious betrayal, just repetition. Small moments, stacked quietly on top of each other, like papers accumulating on a desk you keep meaning to clear. The phone stayed face up at dinners. Work stories replaced shared stories. His laughter belonged to other rooms, digital or otherwise. And I adjusted. That's what I do. I adjust. If he was distracted, I made conversations shorter. If he seemed tired, I postponed things I wanted to talk about. If he cancelled a plan because something came up, I said, "It's fine," before he even finished explaining. I became efficient with disappointment. One evening, we were invited to a friend's birthday gathering. I had spent time choosing a dress, something soft, understated, but beautiful, not for attention, just to feel like a woman who still existed outside logistics. When we arrived, he introduced me to someone new from his office. "This is Gemma," he said, resting a hand briefly at my back. "She's the calm one, keeps me from making reckless decisions." The man laughed. "So you're the responsible half?" I smiled. Again. I noticed that he didn't mention my career this time. Didn't mention that I facilitated high-stakes negotiations. Didn't mention that companies paid me to untangle complex human dynamics. I was translated into a personality trait that made him look balanced. Later that night, I tried to insert myself into a conversation about a new industry shift, something I knew well. I began explaining a perspective. He interrupted mid-sentence. "Gem, that's not really how it works in this field," he said lightly, still smiling. I froze for half a second. It was subtle, a correction wrapped in charm, but I knew my information was accurate. I had worked with clients in that exact sector. I could have pushed back. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth creating tension at a party. I told myself he was just simplifying. I told myself that intelligent people don't need to win conversations. But on the drive home, I stared out the window and felt something heavy settle inside me. It wasn't anger, it was erosion. Because when someone corrects you publicly, even gently, and you don't respond, a silent contract forms. It says, "This is acceptable." And I kept signing it. Weeks passed. The pattern deepened. He would summarize my opinions before I finished explaining them. He'd joke about my overthinking. He'd frame my caution as endearing but slightly excessive. None of it was cruel. All of it was cumulative. And the most uncomfortable truth, I helped it continue. Because I believed maturity meant minimizing conflict. I believed love meant flexibility. I believed that strong women don't need constant validation. So I normalized it. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself relationships evolve. I told myself passion naturally softens into routine. What I didn't say out loud was this. I was starting to feel smaller in rooms where I once felt equal. Not because he demanded it, but because I quietly made space again and again without noticing that the space was never returned. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being respected for your functionality, but not your depth. And I began to feel it. I didn't confront him. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I simply adjusted further. I spoke less at gatherings. I let him tell stories without adding my version. I stopped correcting misrepresentations of my work. From the outside, we looked harmonious. Inside, something was recalibrating. Because the more I stayed quiet to preserve peace, the more I began to question what exactly I was preserving. There's a moment in every dynamic when you realize you're no longer improvising. You're performing. It didn't arrive with a confrontation, it arrived with clarity. We were at his parents' house for a long weekend. His mother adored me, not in a warm, curious way, but in a relieved one. She's so steady. She told him while I stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, "You need someone like her." Need, again. I dried my hands slowly and looked at my reflection in the window above the sink. The version of me staring back looked composed, polite, useful. I tried to imagine how they described him when I wasn't in the room. Ambitious, driven, visionary. And me? Grounded, supportive, stabilizing. I wasn't his equal in their narrative. I was his counterweight. That weekend, I watched how conversations flowed. When financial decisions were discussed, everyone looked to him. When logistics came up, scheduling, coordination, practical details, eyes shifted toward me. It wasn't malicious. It was choreography, and I had learned my steps well. At one point, his father asked about our future plans. "We're still figuring things out," I began. He cut in gently. "Well, my promotion track is pretty clear. We'll see where that takes us." Us! But the sentence belonged to him. Later that night, lying in the guest room, I replayed the day in silence, not with resentment, with analysis. I realized something unsettling. I had slowly accepted a supporting role in a story that was supposed to be shared. Not because he demanded it, because it was easier. Easier to be indispensable than vulnerable. Easier to manage than to need. Somewhere along the way, I had traded emotional presence for operational value. I handled insurance renewals. I tracked investment accounts. I remembered his colleagues' spouses' names. And in return, I received appreciation. But appreciation is not intimacy. That distinction began to crystallize. A few days later, back in our apartment, he mentioned an upcoming networking event. "You'll come?" "Right," he asked casually. "You're good at smoothing conversations." Good at smoothing. I almost smiled. Because that was the role. The emotional shock absorber, the translator, the quiet adjuster of tone. And I had played it so convincingly that even I forgot it wasn't my only dimension. That night, I opened my leather notebook, the one I carried everywhere. It wasn't unusual for me to write reflections. It was how I processed. But this entry was different. I wrote, "What role have I accepted that I never consciously chose?" The answer came quickly. The stabilizer, the regulator, the infrastructure. Not the woman who laughs loudly in kitchens, not the woman whose ideas hold weight in public rooms, not the woman who feels deeply and expects reciprocity. Just the steady one. And the most dangerous realization wasn't that he saw me this way. It was that I had helped construct the image. Because once you're reliable, people stop checking whether you're fulfilled. They assume you're fine. That was the role I had been assigned. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped performing it. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He was out meeting a colleague for coffee. The apartment was unusually still. I decided to clean out old files from my phone photos, screenshots, videos I had meant to organize months ago. That's when I found it. A video from 2 summers earlier. We were in a tiny rental kitchen on the Oregon coast. The lighting was bad. The counter was cluttered. He was attempting to cook something ambitious without reading the instructions properly. At one point, he mispronounced gnocchi with complete confidence. I corrected him. He doubled down. And then we both started laughing, the kind of laughter that interrupts breathing. I had to lean against the counter. He nearly dropped the spoon. It wasn't staged. It wasn't curated. It wasn't for anyone else. It was us. I watched it 3 times, and something inside me tightened. Because I didn't recognize that version of us anymore. Not because we had changed dramatically, but because the ease was gone. I opened my camera roll and scrolled further back. Trip videos, holiday clips, random 5-second recordings of nothing important. In almost every one, there was some moment of spontaneous warmth, teasing, overlapping sentences, shared glances that needed no explanation. Then I scrolled forward. The recent videos were different. Group settings, polished dinners, carefully framed photos, smiles that looked correct but were not uncontrollable. I searched for laughter. Not polite laughter, not social laughter, real laughter. The last one was from 14 months ago. 14? I sat back on the couch and let that number settle. We hadn't laughed together genuinely, freely in over a year. And I hadn't noticed. That realization was the shift. Not because laughter is everything, but because laughter is unguarded. It's what happens when 2 people feel safe enough to drop performance. And somewhere along the way, performance had replaced safety. When he came home later that afternoon, he looked normal, relaxed. He kissed my forehead and asked if I'd had a productive day. I studied his face carefully. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was like standing a few inches further back than usual. He talked about the meeting, about a possible new client. I nodded at the right moments. I asked intelligent questions. But internally, something had shifted from assumption to observation. I was no longer moving inside the relationship. I was studying it. That evening, as we watched television, he laughed at a joke on screen. The sound filled the room. I glanced at him. I couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that because of me. And the painful part wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. I scrolled through old videos and realized the last genuine laughter between us was from another version of our relationship. Not broken, just no longer alive. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a speech about emotional drift. I opened my notebook instead, and I wrote one sentence. When did I start accepting less connection than I require? That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. I stopped assuming we were fine. And once you stop assuming, you begin to see. After that Sunday, I didn't change my behavior dramatically. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still made dinner reservations. I still remembered to restock the pantry. I still asked about his meetings. But internally, I stopped volunteering emotional reassurance. Before, if he seemed distracted, I filled the space. If he was quiet, I checked in. If he seemed stressed, I softened my tone automatically. Now, I observed there's a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from evaluation. Mine had shifted. One evening, he came home later than usual. He didn't text. That wasn't entirely new, but I had always excused it. He's busy. He forgot. It's not intentional. This time, I didn't send a follow-up message. I didn't ask if everything was okay. When he walked in, slightly rushed, he said, "Sorry, it got busy." I nodded. "Okay." And left it there. He paused, as if waiting for something more, a question, maybe a hint of concern. When it didn't come, he continued talking about his day. I noticed something subtle. Without my prompting, he offered fewer details. It was as if he had grown accustomed to my curiosity, sustaining the narrative. Another evening, during a group dinner, he made a light joke about my color-coded calendar obsession. Usually, I would laugh along, reinforcing the harmlessness. This time, I smiled, but I didn't amplify it. The conversation moved on faster than usual. The joke didn't land as strongly. Later, in the car, he said, "You seemed quiet tonight." "I was listening," I replied calmly. He studied me for a second. "Everything okay?" "Yes," and it was. That was the surprising part. I wasn't simmering. I wasn't suppressing rage. I was gathering data. When you stop overfunctioning in a relationship, you see how much structure you were holding up. I stopped preemptively solving small inconveniences. If a bill was due, I let him notice it too. If groceries ran low, I didn't rush to refill them immediately, not to punish, just to rebalance. At first, he didn't notice. Then he did. "Did we run out of coffee?" he asked one morning. "Yes," I said. He waited. I didn't add, "I'll grab some." He grabbed his keys instead. Small shifts, almost invisible, but internally, something powerful was happening. Silence was no longer an accommodation. It was space. Space for him to step forward. Space for me to see whether he would. There's a myth that quiet women are unaware. We're often the most aware in the room. We just don't announce it. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention to who initiated physical affection, who suggested plans, who noticed emotional distance. I noticed that when I stopped bridging every gap, the gaps became visible. Not catastrophic, but undeniable. He began asking, "Are we good?" And instead of reflexively reassuring him, I answered honestly, "We're okay." Okay is not the same as connected. I think that's when he started to sense something was different. Not because I was louder, because I was steadier, less reactive, less eager to smooth tension, and that unsettles people more than confrontation. They mistake silence for weakness. They don't realize it can also be preparation. When people imagine preparation, they picture secrecy with sharp edges. Mine was quieter than that. I didn't open a hidden bank account in the middle of the night. I didn't consult lawyers in dramatic secrecy. There was no cinematic turning point. What I did was return to myself. And no one noticed. I extended my consulting hours selectively. I accepted 2 new clients who required strategic restructuring work, high-level, discrete assignments, the kind that demanded precision and paid accordingly. When he asked why I was busier, I said simply, "Opportunity." He nodded approvingly. "That's good. Stay sharp." I almost smiled at the irony. I updated my certifications, enrolled in an advanced negotiation course I'd postponed for years because it wasn't urgent, reconnected with a former colleague who had moved into executive leadership and casually mentioned she was building a new advisory board. I wasn't running. I was fortifying. At home, I shifted financially in subtle ways. I reviewed our shared accounts not with suspicion, but with clarity. I calculated my independent liquidity. I organized documents digitally and physically, insurance policies, investment breakdowns, lease terms. I already understood these things. But now, I documented them. Not because I planned an exit, because I refused to be unprepared for one. There's a difference. Emotionally, I also began collecting evidence not against him, but for myself. I noted patterns in my leather notebook. Who initiates repair? Who initiates intimacy? Who notices absence? The answers were consistent. I stopped over-explaining my thoughts. If he dismissed an idea lightly, I didn't argue to be heard. I simply redirected my energy towards spaces where I was respected without resistance. Work became invigorating again. In boardrooms, my voice carried weight. Executives paused when I spoke. They asked follow-up questions. They valued nuance. The contrast was sharp. One afternoon, after facilitating a particularly complex mediation, a senior partner pulled me aside and said, "You have a way of seeing what everyone else misses." I held on to that sentence, because at home, I had begun to feel like the thing being missed. Socially, I adjusted too. I stopped being the automatic organizer of gatherings. When friends suggested plans, I let someone else coordinate. If no one did, I let the event dissolve. Surprisingly, some connections faded quickly. Apparently, my initiative had been the glue. The realization wasn't bitter. It was educational. At night, I started sleeping differently, deeper. Not because things were better, but because I wasn't internally negotiating every micro discomfort anymore. I wasn't asking, how do I keep this stable? I was asking, is this aligned? He sensed the shift, but misinterpreted it. You seem more independent lately, he said once, almost cautiously. I am, I replied. It wasn't defiant. It was factual. He assumed it was a professional ambition. He didn't recognize it as emotional recalibration. That's what they never notice, the quiet recalculations happening beneath composure. I wasn't detaching impulsively. I was measuring. One evening, I reread older entries in my notebook. Pages filled with observations about minimizing needs, about rationalizing dismissals, about preserving harmony. The contrast between those pages and my current tone was stark. Earlier entries sounded like negotiation. Recent ones sounded like an evaluation. I no longer wrote, how can I fix this? I wrote, is this sustainable? And when you ask that question honestly, the answers arrive without drama. Around that time, I also met with a financial advisor framed as portfolio optimization, which was true. We discussed diversification, risk exposure, long-term projections. But what I was really confirming was this. If I needed to stand alone, I could. That knowledge changes your posture, not outwardly, but internally. Because dependence softens your boundaries, capability sharpens them. He still believed the dynamic was intact, that I was simply focused, ambitious, quiet, as always. He didn't realize that quiet had transformed from accommodation to assessment. And assessment leads somewhere, not impulsively, not emotionally, but inevitably. The private reveal didn't involve a confession. It involved numbers. One Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room downtown, reviewing projections with my financial advisor. The meeting was calm, analytical, neutral. We adjusted allocations, reviewed performance metrics, discussed liquidity ratios. Then she turned her laptop slightly toward me. If you wanted to, she said carefully, you could sustain your current lifestyle independently, without compromise. The sentence landed softly. She didn't know the emotional context behind it. To her, it was simply data, evidence of stability, proof that my years of disciplined saving and strategic investment had compounded effectively. But to me, it was clarity. For the first time, I understood something without emotion attached to it. I was not financially dependent on this relationship. I had told myself for years that we were building something together, and we were. But somewhere along the way, I had subconsciously equated partnership with security. Security was never the issue. Choice was. Walking back to my car, I felt something unfamiliar. Not excitement, not relief. Authority. Not over him, over myself. That evening, I didn't announce anything. I didn't change tone. I didn't initiate a heavy conversation about where we stand. I made dinner. We ate. He talked about an upcoming presentation. I listened, but internally, a recalibration had finalized. Because now, every interaction was filtered through a new awareness. I am here because I choose to be, not because I need to be, and choice demands standards. Over the next few days, I began quietly testing something not manipulatively, but honestly. I reduced emotional labor further. When he seemed distant, I didn't bridge the gap. When he forgot to ask about my day, I didn't volunteer details. When he defaulted to talking about his goals, I let the conversation run its course without steering it back to us. The result was revealing. The emotional vacuum widened. Without my subtle corrections, the imbalance became visible. He didn't lean in. He continued forward, assuming the structure would hold. That's when I understood something even more sobering than the financial clarity. If I removed my invisible contributions entirely, the intimacy would not regenerate on its own. That realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Like discovering that a plant you've been watering for years has stopped absorbing water. You can continue pouring, or you can acknowledge that something fundamental has changed. One night, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, he laughed at something on his phone again, reflexively. I glanced at him, and instead of sadness, I felt detachment. Not coldness, distance. I wasn't competing for his attention anymore. I wasn't analyzing whether he should be laughing with me instead. I was observing compatibility. There's a moment in every relationship where the question shifts from, can we fix this, to, is this aligned with who I am becoming? That was my private reveal. Not that he was terrible, not that I had been wrong, but that I had outgrown the version of myself that accepted minimal reciprocity as stability. A few days later, he said, "You've been very calm lately." "I've always been calm," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "No, this is different." He couldn't name it, because what he was sensing wasn't anger. It was the absence of negotiation. And when negotiation disappears, what remains is truth. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Clear that I could stay. Clear that I could leave. Clear that if I stayed, it would require change not from me compensating further, but from both of us rebuilding something real. And clarity is dangerous in a dynamic built on assumptions, because once you see fully, you can't unsee. Clarity doesn't force action. It presents options. For weeks after that realization, I lived inside possibility. I could stay and have a conversation, a real one, the kind that risks destabilizing everything, but at least gives the relationship an honest chance to evolve. I could leave quietly, cleanly, without accusation. We weren't married. There were no children. Logistically, it would be manageable. Or I could continue as we were stable, efficient, emotionally diluted. The third option was the easiest. That's what made it dangerous. Because comfort can anesthetize dissatisfaction just enough to make it tolerable. I didn't rush. I observed him carefully, not critically, not looking for evidence to justify departure, just honestly. When I stopped filling the silence, he filled it with productivity talk. When I stopped initiating affection, he assumed fatigue. When I stopped praising his ambitions, he leaned more heavily into external validation. He never asked the question I had been asking for months. Are we connected? Instead, he asked, are we good? And that difference mattered. One night, I invited him to take a walk with me. No phones, just the neighborhood streets we had walked 100 times before. The air was cool. The city was quiet. Halfway down the block, I said, "Do you feel close to me?" He looked slightly surprised. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't I?" I let the silence stretch. "I don't think we've really laughed together in over a year," I said calmly. He frowned slightly. "That's not true." "It is," I replied. I checked. The statement wasn't accusatory. It was factual. He tried to recall moments, mentioned a dinner with friends, a vacation photo. "Polite laughter," I said softly. "Not the kind that feels unguarded." He grew quiet. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "I didn't realize that mattered that much," he admitted. And that was the decision point. Because it did matter. Not the laughter itself, but what it represented. Ease, presence, mutual curiosity. If he didn't recognize its absence as significant, then we were operating from fundamentally different definitions of intimacy. We finished the walk without escalation, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. That night, as he slept, I lay awake, not anxious, not emotional, just decisive. Staying would mean reteaching someone how to value depth they hadn't noticed fading. Leaving would mean honoring the version of myself that required it without instruction. The irreversible option wasn't moving out immediately. It was choosing not to shrink further. And I realized I had already made that choice weeks ago. So the decision crystallized quietly. If change didn't come from his awareness, not my management, I would step away. Not angrily, not reactively, but completely. Because love that requires constant translation is not partnership. And I was done translating. After that walk, I didn't issue an ultimatum. I didn't create deadlines or emotional countdowns. I simply stopped compensating, and I began preparing for the possibility that nothing would shift. The first action was logistical. Our lease was up in 4 months. I marked the date in my calendar not dramatically, just clearly. I reviewed the termination clauses, underlined key timelines, quietly researched alternative apartments within commuting distance of my clients. I haven't toured anything yet. I gathered options. At work, I accepted a long-term consulting engagement that required strategic availability, the kind of contract that anchored my income independently for the next year. It wasn't impulsive. It was aligned with the professional momentum I had already rebuilt. He congratulated me. Big year for both of us, he said, assuming the trajectories were shared. I nodded. Financially, I separated more than I announced. We already maintained partial individual accounts, but I adjusted automatic transfers, increased my personal reserve, updated beneficiaries on policies that had once defaulted to him without question. Not as punishment, as clarity. At home, I observed whether anything recalibrated after our walk. For a few days, he was more attentive. He asked about my projects, suggested we try a new restaurant, even left his phone in another room one evening. It felt intentional, but not sustained. Within a week, old rhythms returned. His focus drifted back outward. Conversations centered on his goals. When I didn't amplify enthusiasm, he interpreted it as fatigue rather than distance. I stopped correcting the misunderstanding because I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was testing durability. One evening, he said casually, "You've seemed very self-contained lately." "I am," I replied. He studied me, perhaps waiting for elaboration. There was none. That's what moving in silence looks like. Not secretive, not deceptive, just self-directed. I began sorting my belongings mentally. What was mine before him, what we acquired together, what I would take if I left. I digitized shared documents and stored copies in a private cloud folder. The actions were efficient, almost administrative. Emotionally, I felt steady. No rage, no urgency, just inevitability forming slowly. I also made one more decision, the most important one. I stopped imagining the version of him that could return. There's a subtle trap in long relationships. We stay loyal to potential instead of reality. I released potential. I evaluated reality. And reality was this. Without my constant emotional calibration, the connection thinned. Without my effort, intimacy did not regenerate. One night, as we sat in comfortable silence, the kind that once felt warm, I realized it now felt neutral, functional. We coexisted peacefully. But peace without closeness is just quiet distance. He reached for my hand absent-mindedly, eyes still on the television. I let him hold it. There was no resentment in the gesture, just absence. That's when I understood something important. When love becomes optional rather than mutual, the departure begins long before the exit. I didn't announce my timeline, but internally, I knew. If nothing fundamentally shifted before the lease renewal conversation, I would not renew. And he still believed we were simply going through a phase. He had no idea that I was already standing at the door calmly, patiently, with both hands free. The consequences didn't arrive with a dramatic reveal. They arrived with an absence. It started subtly. I stopped reminding him about small things, a dinner with friends, a deadline for submitting paperwork, a birthday card he had intended to send, not maliciously, simply because I was no longer managing the ecosystem. When he forgot, he seemed mildly inconvenienced. "Why didn't you mention it?" he asked once, scrolling through his email after missing an RSVP window. "I thought you had it," I said evenly. He nodded, distracted. But over time, the pattern accumulated. Plans fell through. Small social invitations stopped coming as frequently. Not because people disliked him, but because I had been the one nurturing those threads. He began to feel friction in places that had once been smooth. One Saturday morning, he opened the pantry and frowned. "We're out of half the basics." "Yes," I replied, sipping my coffee. He looked at me for a moment, confused by my neutrality. In the past, I would have apologized preemptively, even if it wasn't my sole responsibility. This time, I didn't. He went to the store. It wasn't about groceries. It was about gravity shifting. At work, he mentioned feeling more stressed lately. "Everything just feels heavier," he said one evening, "like I'm juggling more." I listened quietly. He was juggling more. because I had quietly set down what I used to carry. Emotionally, too. He began reaching for reassurance more frequently. Are we okay? He asked one night again. We're stable, I said. He frowned slightly. That sounds unclinical. It's accurate, I replied. For the first time, I saw unease register clearly. He began initiating more conversations, not about us, but about logistics, the lease, future travel plans, long-term investments. It was as if he sensed movement beneath the surface, but couldn't locate its origin. The most noticeable shift happened socially. At a gathering with friends, someone asked how we were doing. He answered quickly, busy, growing, you know how it is. I didn't add anything. Later, one of our friends pulled me aside. You've been quieter lately, she said gently. Everything okay? Yes, I said. And I meant it, because peace had replaced anxiety. What he began to feel wasn't anger from me. It was the removal of invisible scaffolding. Without constant emotional translation, misunderstandings lingered longer. Without my proactive warmth, the atmosphere cooled slightly. Nothing explosive, just less ease. One night, after a long day, he said something that surprised me. I feel like I'm losing you. The words were soft, not accusatory, almost confused. I looked at him carefully. You can't lose something you're actively holding, I said calmly. He didn't respond immediately, because deep down, he knew. The relationship had been sustained by momentum, not attention. And momentum fades when one person stops pushing. He began trying in small, visible ways. Cooking dinner unexpectedly, suggesting a weekend getaway, leaving his phone in another room more often. But the effort that begins after distance becomes visible carries a different energy. It feels reactive. And I wasn't looking for a reaction. I was looking for awareness. The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposure of how much emotional architecture I had built silently. And now that it was gone, he could feel the draft. Not yet the full cold, but enough to realize that something essential had shifted. And for the first time, I think he understood that stability had never been automatic. It had been me. The panic didn't explode. It crept in. About 3 weeks before our lease renewal deadline, he brought it up casually over dinner. We should probably sign soon, he said. I don't want to deal with last-minute stress. I set my fork down carefully. I'm not renewing, I said. Silence doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels suspended. He blinked once, as if he hadn't heard me clearly. What do you mean? I'm not renewing the lease. There was no anger in my voice, no tremor, just a fact. He leaned back slightly. You're joking? I'm not. The room felt different instantly, not loud, not volatile, just sharpened. Gemma, we didn't talk about this. We did, I said gently, just not directly. He ran a hand through his hair, processing. This is because of that conversation about laughing, he asked, trying to anchor the moment to something specific, something solvable. It's not about laughter, I replied. It's about connection. He exhaled sharply, not angry, unsettled. I thought we were fine, busy, but fine. I know, I said, and I meant it. That was the tragedy. He had genuinely believed that smoothness equaled closeness. I can fix this, he said quickly. We can do counseling, take time off, go somewhere, whatever you need. The offers came fast now, structured, action-oriented, the way he solved professional problems. But intimacy isn't a project plan. I don't need grand gestures. I said I needed awareness before distance became normal. He looked at me as if I had moved further away physically, though I hadn't. When did you decide this? He asked quietly. Not all at once, I answered. It happened gradually. That's the part people don't understand. By the time one person announces departure, they've often already grieved privately. He was just beginning to feel the loss. I had been feeling it for months. I didn't know you were this unhappy, he said. I wasn't unhappy, I replied. I was underconnected. He stared at me, as if trying to decode the language. I thought you were just calm, independent. I am, I said, but I'm also human. For the first time in a long time, I saw fear in his expression. Not fear of anger, fear of permanence. He reached across the table for my hand. This time, he looked directly at me. Don't do this, he said softly. There was no manipulation in his tone, just regret. And that's what made it heavier. Because I didn't hate him. I wasn't trying to punish him. I simply refused to return to a version of myself that accepted being emotionally peripheral. I'm not doing anything to you. I said quietly. I'm choosing something for me. He didn't argue loudly. He didn't accuse. He sat there stunned by the realization that stability had never been guaranteed. It had been maintained, and maintenance had stopped. The next few days were heavy with unspoken tension. He moved through the apartment differently, watched me carefully, tried to initiate deeper conversations, but something fundamental had shifted beyond repair. Because once you see the gap clearly, you cannot convince yourself it isn't there. And the most painful part, he wasn't a villain. He was just too late. The final conversation didn't happen at a dramatic hour. It happened on a Tuesday evening, at the dining table where we had shared hundreds of ordinary meals. No raised voices, no tears, no ultimatums. Just clarity. He had asked if we could really talk. I agreed. He sat across from me, hands folded loosely, as if preparing for a performance review. I need to understand, he began. Was I that inattentive, or did you just stop loving me? The question was sincere. I didn't stop loving you, I said calmly. I stopped feeling met. He frowned slightly. I thought we were a team. We were operationally a team, I replied, but emotionally, I carried more. He looked down at the table, absorbing that. I would have stepped up if I knew, he said. I know, I answered. And I did. That was the difficult part. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel. He simply adapted to the version of me that required less. I continued gently. When I stopped compensating, the distance became visible. That wasn't punishment. It was exposure. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. I thought your independence meant you didn't need much, he admitted. My independence means I don't tolerate misalignment, I said quietly. It doesn't mean I don't need a connection. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just heavy with understanding. I feel blindsided, he confessed. I felt alone, I replied. We held eye contact. No anger, no theatrics, just two people acknowledging that the story they thought they were writing had quietly diverged. He asked if there was anything he could say to change my mind. I paused not for effect, but for honesty. If I stay, I said carefully, it will be because I'm convinced we both recognize what was missing, not because you're afraid of losing me. He nodded slowly. And are you convinced, he asked? I didn't rush the answer. No, that was the truth. He swallowed, absorbing it without argument. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said something that stayed with me. I didn't realize stability could feel like distance to you. It didn't at first, I said softly. It became distant when curiosity faded. He closed his eyes briefly, as if replaying months in his mind. There was regret there, but regret is retrospective. And I needed presence. We discussed logistics calmly, timeline, moving arrangements, dividing shared items. There was no hostility in the planning, just practicality layered over something more fragile. As we stood from the table, he hesitated. I really did love you, he said. I know, I replied. That was the final exchange. Not explosive, not cinematic, just honest. And sometimes, confrontation without heat is more powerful than any argument because it leaves no doubt. Only truth. I live alone now. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. There was no symbolic last box carried down the stairs with trembling hands. No final look back at the doorway. Just logistics completed with care. A lease was signed, keys exchanged, furniture is divided fairly. The apartment I chose is smaller, intentional. It has large windows that let in afternoon light, and a kitchen that forces me to be present while cooking because there's nowhere to pace. The first night, it was very quiet. Not heavy, not echoing, just unoccupied. I slept deeply. That surprised me. For months before leaving, I had been thinking constantly, evaluating, measuring, recalibrating, but once the decision became action, my body relaxed in a way I hadn't anticipated, as if it trusted me again. The first morning, I made coffee and sat on the floor because I hadn't bought a table yet. Sunlight stretched across the blank wall. The space didn't know my habits. It didn't anticipate where I would place my bag or how I preferred to fold blankets. It was neutral. And neutrality felt like a possibility. There's a misconception that choosing yourself after a long relationship must feel triumphant. It didn't. It felt aligned. There's a difference. Triumph is loud and comparative. Alignment is quiet and internal. In the months that followed, I rebuilt slowly. Not my independence that had always been there, my presence. I noticed how often, in the past, I had pre-edited myself, softened opinions, reduced intensity, translated my emotional language into something less demanding. Now, I don't rush to make my needs smaller. At work, this shift became obvious. In meetings, when I sense a misalignment in strategy, I say so directly, not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. I no longer cushion observations with excessive disclaimers. Interestingly, nothing collapsed when I stopped cushioning. If anything, my voice carries more weight. A senior executive told me recently, "You speak like someone who isn't afraid of losing approval." He was right, because I'm not. Approval built on self-minimization is not worth sustaining. Socially, I've changed too, but not in ways that isolate me. I host smaller gatherings now, fewer people, deeper conversations. I don't manage the atmosphere the way I used to. I let silences exist. I let others take the initiative. And I pay attention. If someone dominates a conversation without curiosity, I don't compete. I note it. If someone asks thoughtful follow-up questions, I invest. I've become selective, not guarded, not skeptical selective. That selectivity has returned something I didn't realize I had lost: delight. Real delight. The kind that shows up in spontaneous laughter. And yes, I notice it now. One evening, cooking alone, I misread a recipe and added salt twice. I tasted it, made a face, and started laughing at myself fully, unfiltered. It startled me, not because I was alone, but because the laugh sounded familiar. It sounded like the woman in that old kitchen video, the one I thought had disappeared. She hadn't. She had just been contained. There's something powerful about recognizing that you were never too much. You were just in a dynamic that benefited from you being less. I don't hate him. I don't rewrite him as careless or cruel to justify my choice. He loved me in the way he knew how, through stability, planning, ambition. But we defined intimacy differently. For him, the absence of conflict meant security. For me, the presence of curiosity meant connection. Neither definition was wrong. They were simply incompatible over time. And incompatibility doesn't require resentment. It requires honesty. I think that's the part people misunderstand most. Leaving doesn't have to be loud. It can be a steady exhale after months of holding your breath. I walk differently now. Not in a dramatic, empowered stride kind of way. Just without that subtle inward negotiation that used to run constantly in the background. Is this too much to say? Should I soften this? Is it worth correcting? That mental noise is gone. And in its absence, there's clarity. I don't perform calmly anymore. I inhabit it. There's also a new boundary I didn't have before. If I ever sense myself becoming infrastructure again, the emotional regulator, the quiet compensator, I pause. Not to blame the other person, to check myself. Because the truth is, I helped build the dynamic I left. I overfunctioned. I minimized needs. I equated resilience with silence. Now, resilience looks different. It looks like asking directly, "Do you feel close to me?" And being prepared for the answer. If a future partnership arrives, it will not be built on admiration for my steadiness alone. It will require curiosity about my interior world. And I will offer the same. I want laughter that interrupts breathing again. Not because it's romantic. Because it signals ease. And ease cannot be engineered. It must be mutual. Most importantly, I am no longer afraid of being alone. That doesn't mean I reject companionship. It means I refuse companionship that slowly erodes presence. There is peace in my apartment now, but it's not the quiet distance I once tolerated. It's intentional solitude. There's a difference between being alone and being unseen. I would choose solitude every time over invisibility. That's who I am now. Not hardened, not cynical, just calibrated. A woman who understands that stability without connection is maintenance, and I am not a maintenance system. I am meant to be experienced, known, and met. And if that doesn't happen, I remain whole, aligned, and fully visible to myself. If you've listened this far, you probably understand something that took me years to articulate. Relationships rarely collapse in a single moment. They dilute, they drift quietly while both people assume the structure is intact. I didn't leave because of one argument. I didn't leave because of cruelty. I left because I realized I had been negotiating my own emotional requirements down to something manageable. And manageable is not the same as meaningful. The most dangerous phase in any relationship isn't conflict. It's a smooth disconnection. When things function well enough that no one questions the depth, when stability replaces curiosity, when appreciation replaces presence, I discovered we hadn't laughed together in over a year, and that realization didn't break us. It revealed us. I scrolled through old videos and realized the last genuine laughter between us was from another version of our relationship. And once I saw that, I couldn't pretend we were still living inside that version. The moral isn't leave at the first sign of distance. It's this: pay attention to what feels alive. Pay attention to whether you are being met, not just managed, admired, or relied upon. And most importantly, ask yourself, are you staying because you are deeply connected, or because you are deeply capable of enduring? There's nothing dramatic about choosing yourself quietly. No applause, no cinematic soundtrack, just a steady decision to stop shrinking. If you've ever realized that your role in someone's life slowly replaced your presence, when did you first notice the shift? I'm reading the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.